The Skull Merchant came out at a time when my interest in the new killer's behavior was putting out had dropped quite a bit. The rate at which they were spamming new DLCs made me see them more as soulless mass production rather than valuable additions to the game. So I was more excited about the changes they made to the older characters as well as the base gameplay. This led to me almost completely ignoring the release of the Skull Merchant. I didn't download the original PTB and didn't even check Twitter that evening to see what people were saying. The latter was probably the right decision, because knowing the DBD community, I have legitimate doubts I'd find anything there besides 5,000 screenshots showcasing her thick. I just stopped by someone's stream for several minutes, probably at Zdarva's, to get the gist of what her power did and, of course, to see the Mori, realized that I was more interested in the Shelterwoods rework, and continued with my day. When it became clear that the Skull Merchant was gonna be a turning point for the game, I regretted not checking out that PTB more thoroughly, because I knew I'd have to make a history video about her one day, and for videos like this, it really helps to know more about a character's first version than just a description of their power. Luckily, about 2 months ago, I actually got the chance to get my hands on one of the early versions of the Skull Merchant, thanks to a group of people who had spent the past year relentlessly working on bringing back the private server. In short, the private server is a version of DBD set up to support modding. The first version of it died about 2 years ago, but thanks to the efforts of the FIFINE team, we now have its improved successor. Initially, FIFINE set it up based on version 6.5.2, but while I was working on my previous video, it was suddenly updated to version 6.7.0, the version that came out just 2 months after the Skull Merchant's release. Not exactly her original state, but pretty close. So with a little imagination, we should be able to get a more or less accurate picture of how her power worked at release. And plus this way I won't have to rely on footage from random YouTube channels that have never heard of recording in anything higher than 720p 30 FPS, but that's beside the point. By the way, if you're interested in messing around with mods just like in the good old days, you should definitely get on the private server. They got some really nice stuff there. Like for example, how about at Zdarva as a survivor? Where else are you gonna see that? Alright, that's not really him, it's Bibik Rakesh, the mascot survivor of the private server, but I can't be the only one who thinks they look the same. Or maybe you're one of those dedicated Kate fans whose sole purpose of existence is to find a cosmetic combo that's gonna make her reveal more skin. Well, Infernal's got you covered. This isn't a paid promotion. I'm not affiliated with Infernal in any way, shape, or form. I was just genuinely impressed with the work they did, and since I'm using their build in this video, I figured it would only be fair to give them a shout out. The invite link to their Discord server will be in the description. See you there, Kate Gunners. So the 2023 PTB Skull Merchant. What was so different about her? Well, why don't you look at this absolutely batshit list of changes she's gone through over the 2 years she's been in the game and answer it yourself. Everything, alright? Everything was different, except for the fact that she still had drones. She started the match with only 4 drones and not 6, but to make up for it, they had a much stronger effect. To begin with, she had no cooldowns for deploying drones. The speed at which she could spam them depended only on how fast she could get 22 meters away from the previous drone, because that was the minimum distance between drones back then. When she deployed a drone, it took 3 seconds to boot up and then entered active mode. In this mode, it created a 20-meter detection zone around it. When a survivor entered it, the Skull Merchant's radar notified her about it via special audio cue. If she looked at the radar, it would display their exact location as long as they stayed in the zone. Survivors could tell when they were being watched because when it happened, a giant eyeball icon popped up over their head. Staying in the detection zone filled the survivors' lock-on progress. After 10 seconds, they became fully locked on, which made them exposed and revealed their position to the Skull Merchant through Killer Instinct. Both effects were permanent as long as the survivors stayed in the zone, plus exposed lingered for 60 seconds after leaving the zone. Re-entering the zone while they were still exposed reactivated Killer Instinct, but more importantly, reset and froze the exposed timer until they left the zone again. And that's when the bullshit started, because it basically made it so that you couldn't loop the Skull Merchant without being permanently one-shot. If you committed to a tile, she'd immediately drop a drone there, and you'd inevitably get exposed. If you managed to win the tile, she'd follow you to the next one and drop another drone, prolonging your exposed timer. And she'd keep doing this until Bloodlust eventually let her catch up and insta-down you. The only way to avoid that was by not looping her until you were injured, at which point her drones wouldn't matter anymore. If you were healthy, your best bet was to break off from the tile as soon as you saw her deploy a drone. Sure, since placing drones didn't slow her down, in most cases she'd catch up and hit you just seconds after, but it was still worth it, cause this way you'd last longer thanks to the distance gained from the post-hit acceleration. But you couldn't take too long to decide whether or not you wanted to run away. You had to act fast while the drone was still booting up, otherwise you risk not making it out of the detection zone in time when the drone activated, getting a bit of lock-on progress. progress. And while it did gradually decrease over time, you weren't guaranteed to clear it completely before having to deal with another drone. Because first, the rollback wasn't instant, and second, it had a 10-second delay after you left the zone. A few slip-ups like that and boom, you're one shot. And from there, well, you know what happens next. Now that I'm recording this, I realized there was an absolute blessing that behavior figured to not allow the Skull Merchant to put drones closer than 16 meters from hooked survivors. That would have been a really f***ed up combo. But that wasn't the only effect of the detection zone. On top of everything mentioned above, if the Skull Merchant herself stayed within it, she became undetectable. This effect kicked in after 2 seconds and lingered for 2 seconds after she left the zone. In theory, this was enough to let you use her as a full-on stealth killer. If you placed several drones at the minimum possible distance from each other, the 2-second linger effect would be just enough to bridge the gaps between their detection zones, and as a result keep your terror radius suppressed the entire time. In practice though, your drones wouldn't often be that close together. Normally you want them near gens, totems, loops and other crucial areas, and those tend to be a little spread out, so in a real match your terror radius wouldn't stay hidden that often. Plus after 30 seconds, drones switched to the scouting mode, which removed the detection zone and as a result the undetectable effect. But that was still enough to occasionally catch survivors off guard if they weren't paying attention. The duration of active mode could be prolonged. For example, when the survivor entered the detection zone, it paused its timer until they walked out again. Once the timer ran out and the drones finally switched to the scouting mode, you could remotely force them back to active mode. This part of the Skull Merchant's base kit was a huge component of what made her so nasty to go against, because it allowed for a much more efficient map control, to the point where sometimes avoiding the detection zone of a drone became nearly impossible. On the downside, this ability was a little sluggish. First, it had a 10-second cooldown, so you couldn't reactivate multiple drones in a row. Second, the cooldown indicator only showed up when you were looking at the radar, meaning most of the time you had no clue when the ability was ready again. Keeping the radar out all the time wasn't an option, since it slowed you down from your default 4.6 meters per second to 4.4. And on top of that, even if the cooldown was over, the option to reactivate the drone wouldn't show up unless you put the radar away and pulled it out again. It was a f***ing mess, alright, but let's just call it the tax for playing the Skull Merchant. When the drone switched to the scouting mode, their detection zone was replaced with 2 rotating laser beams, each 10 meters long. Together, they covered the same area as the detection zone. If a beam touched the survivor, the drone instantly switched back to active mode and started giving them lock-on progress. Unlike today, the beams couldn't be dodged by standing still or crouching, so if you wanted to get past them, you had to sync your movement with the movement of the beams. Kinda like going through a revolving door in a supermarket. Technically, if you made it at least halfway to the drone where the beam cone was thinner, you could crouch under it. Like, why? If you could just make a couple of more steps and disable the drone. Just like today, to disable a drone, survivors had to quote-unquote hack it. That's the official term for the QTE, where you need to enter 5 random direction keys in the right order. After a drone was deployed, it went to an unhackable state for 12 seconds. That's when it flies higher and puts itself out of reach. This served as an extra layer of gen defense, because not every survivor would choose to wait for the drone to come down while sitting on the gen in the detection zone. Those of them that didn't feel comfortable being one-shot would most likely stay outside of it, which bought the Skull Merchant precious time. Likewise, the drone became unhackable for 10 seconds if you touched one of its beams while it was in scouting mode, which is why mastering the revolving door technique was crucial. Hacking a drone successfully made it disappear and put it on a 10-second cooldown, after which it automatically returned to the Skull Merchant's inventory. I'm not gonna lie, such a short cooldown felt really nice, because it allowed for constant drone spam to torment survivors even more. But on the other hand, the fact that hacked drones didn't stay where you originally placed them and didn't automatically reboot after some time like they do on live meant that you had to waste a lot of unnecessary time putting them back where you wanted them. As a trade-off for hacking drones, survivors got tagged with a claw trap that continuously broadcast their location to the Skull Merchant's radar, as if they were constantly in the detection zone, just like it does today, except that it also displayed the eyeball icon over the survivor's head, like I've explained before. The cool part about this icon was that it was visible not only to the survivor being watched, but to all their teammates too. As a solo survivor, if you grouped up with someone who had a claw trap, it allowed you to know exactly when the Skull Merchant was using her radar. That way, the trapped teammate wouldn't give away your location without you realizing it. And vice versa, if you were the one with the trap, your teammates wouldn't be caught off guard. As a bonus, claw traps made it impossible to see the beams of drones in scouting mode, which could make sense if the game treated it like a gamble, where you had to guess where the beams were facing to avoid them. But that wasn't the case, because as soon as a trapped survivor entered the drone's area of effect, no matter where the beams were facing or whether they touched the survivor, the drone would instantly switch to active mode and become unhackable until they left the zone. The latter made it impossible to get rid of drones while having a claw trap without help from another survivor who wasn't trapped. Claw traps had a battery life of 45 seconds, after which you had to manually remove them by hacking, just like you would hack a drone. Failing the trap, hacking would cancel the interaction and restore a portion of its battery. Overall sounds easy, but there was a twist. Stepping in the drone's area of effect with this thing still attached to you? Just get f***ing ready for this. Automatically refilled its battery. This meant that if the Skull Merchant was super campy with gens and kept placing drones near them, you couldn't work on them without constantly showing up on her radar and being exposed. Because the claw trap didn't let you disable the drone, and the drone didn't let you get rid of the trap. It's like, behavior, how annoying did you want this killer to be? To get rid of the drone, you'd have to wait out the trap's timer outside of the detection zone. But 45 seconds of doing nothing just to put a drone on a 10-second cooldown? Ugh, I don't know, man. That's gonna be like the slowest way to throw a game ever. And that's not even mentioning that the Skull Merchant wouldn't just let you chill for 45 seconds for free. She'd probably track you through the radar and down you way faster. But hey, on the bright side, dying would actually remove the trap. What? You really thought Behavior didn't think this through? Failing the drone hack made it unhackable for 5 seconds. Same if you press shift to cancel the interaction, it also counted as a fail. If the drone was in scouting mode, it switched back to active. If it was already active, it stayed this way. And that was pretty bad, because think about it. Even in the worst case, if a survivor ran through the detection zone and failed the hack, they still had 3 seconds before getting exposed. And since the lock-on timer paused while interacting with drones, they could just try again. If they succeeded, they'd get rid of the drone with basically no punishment. And that's assuming they'd even fail the first attempt. I mean, let's be real, it takes a complete f***ing idiot to mess up pressing 5 arrows correctly. If you made it this far into the video, who the f*** are you? Are you even human? Because I don't think a human being would be able to sit through 10 minutes of someone explaining all 5,735 mechanics of the original Skull Merchant's base kit. And it's only gonna get worse, because now we're stepping into the territory of her add-ons. Before we get into it, I've got a quick announcement. As the smartest, most credible, and let's be honest, most physically attractive Dead by Daylight content creator, I was personally invited by Behavior to playtest the new version of the Skull Merchant they're releasing soon. The new version is bringing back the detection zone, and it's gonna be 652 meters wide. Her drones will be permanently unhackable, and once the lock-on meter fills up, survivors will become one-shot in real life. But before you start losing it in the comments, there's also good news, because I, being the smartest, most credible, and again most physically attractive content creator, have the power to stop all this. I can't tell Behavior not to go through with it, but only under one condition. You have to subscribe to my second channel. See, when I make videos for this channel, I record tons of footage, but only a fraction of it actually makes it into the final cut. And that's a shame, because a lot of really cool moments end up never being seen by anyone. So I figured, why not use all this footage for creating gameplay montages for the second channel? In fact, I've already uploaded my first video there. It's a quick showcase of my hillbilly progress after about 50-ish hours of playing him. So if that sounds interesting, go check it out. The link will be in the description and the pinned comment. Alright, back to the video. After messing around with the old Skull Merchant for a couple of days, I can tell you that the situation with her add-ons wasn't that great. Not only didn't she have too many good ones, but the ones that were bad were so bad that you wouldn't want them even if the Blood Web offered them for free. To give you an idea about the ratio of good to bad add-ons, let's go over each of them and make a quick tier list. Ultrasonic Speaker. Survivors with a claw trap destroy pallets when fast vaulting them. If the trap's battery is empty, it gets destroyed too. Absolutely based. Considering that it applied even outside of the chest, I'm actually surprised that it was just a brown add-on. S tier. High power floodlight. Survivors in the detection zone suffer from blindness. Lingers for 15 seconds after leaving the zone. Not bad, allowed you to partially counter a whole bunch of aura reading perks, including one of the strongest windows of opportunity, though the linger timer could be a little longer. C tier. High current upgrade. Decreases the cooldown of the drone activation ability by 10%. With the drone cooldown lasting 10 seconds, it bought you literally 1 second. It wouldn't even be worth the time you'd spend equipping this add-on. F tier. Adivalente number 1. Survivors in the detection zone suffer from 20% smaller skill checks. Lingers for 15 seconds. By itself, not that great, because it affected only bad players who needed aim assist to hit the spacebar. Plus the fact that it was tied to skill checks meant that it was RNG dependent, and that's never good. But it could work as an extra component in full-on skill check builds, so I guess C tier? Stereo remote mic. Increases the unhackable stage duration of drones by 10%. Same as high current upgrade. Drones were never in the state for too long, so the value it provided was neglectable. F tier. Shotgun speakers. Survivors in the detection zone have no skill check warnings. Lingers for 15 seconds. The improved version of Annihilate. Still RNG dependent, but the effect was so much stronger that it was definitely worth it, especially in the combination with the aforementioned Annihilate. This actually took her campy playstyle to a whole new level. A tier. Overcharge. Yeah, behavior really didn't bother with the name for this one. Increases the battery of claw traps by 20% or 9 seconds. Was okay, especially for a yellow add-on. The default 45 seconds wasn't bad too, but it could still be useful if you combine it with an add-on that gave survivors a debuff while they had a trap, so B tier? Low power mode. Increases the duration of the detection zone by 10%. Given the default duration of the detection zone already being super long, it definitely wasn't something you had to rely on consistently. Plus 10% of 30 seconds was only 3 seconds, which I'm not even sure if survivors would notice the difference. E tier, but just because this time it's 3 seconds and not 1. Adaptive lighting. Increases the lingering duration of the undetectable effect after leaving the detection zone by 20%. Straight up crap, because it literally added 0.4 seconds. F tier. Vital targeting processor. Increases the speed at which lock-on builds inside the detection zone by 10%. Again, it wasn't anything crazy, because it shaved off only 1 second. 99.9% survivors wouldn't even be able to tell that something was different. Outside of a chase, 10 and 9 seconds felt roughly the same. In a chase, most survivors would detach from the loop at the first sight of a drone before it started affecting them, so they wouldn't even know you brought this add-on. Well-deserved F tier. Powdered glass. When you hit survivors with claw traps, they suffer from hemorrhage and mangled until fully healed. Same effect as today, but at that time these status effects weren't timed yet, so this add-on opened potential for some cool anti-heal builds. B tier. Loose screw. Survivors in the detection zone suffer from the exhausted status effect. Lingers for 3 seconds. The add-on version of Fearmonger / Mindbreaker / Stop Changing Perk Names. It could have been really good, especially considering that it was before the Dead Hard nerf, which made it activate after getting unhooked. But the short duration ruined everything, because even bad survivors could easily roll back 3 seconds during a chase. D tier. Infrared upgrade. Anytime a claw trap is removed, the survivor's aura is revealed for 4 seconds. The only add-on that hasn't had a single change so far. It was alright I guess, but it was kinda redundant, cause her default tracking was already good enough. C tier. Brown noise generator. Survivors in the detection zone suffer from Oblivious. Lingers for 15 seconds. A very good add-on. If you place drones near gens, it allowed you to punish ballsy survivors who didn't respect the detection zone and kept repairing despite being one-shot. A tier. Randomized strobes. Survivors entering the detection zone suffer from 5% hindered for 3 seconds. One of the best add-ons and one of the few ones that were designed for chases instead of camping gens. S tier. Geographical readout. While in the detection zone, gain 2% haste and 15% speed bonus to damaging gens, breaking pallets and walls, and vaulting. Same as randomized strobes. In fact, if you combine these add-ons, you could turn yourself into a budget anti-looper. Obviously S tier. Expired batteries. All survivors start the trial with a claw trap. Increases the battery life of the starting traps by 150%. These claw traps do not recharge and are automatically destroyed when their battery is empty. Originally, this add-on used to be purple. It was designed to create early pressure, but as a setup killer, the Skull Merchant wasn't very efficient at that. She simply couldn't snowball without her drones. Plus, it was a one-use add-on, so I'm gonna say D tier. Advanced movement prediction. Survivors entering the detection zone have their auras revealed for 6 seconds. Considering that when survivors entered the detection zone you could see them on the radar anyway, it was 100% overkill. But since it was automatic, it didn't require you to pull out the radar, which meant that you didn't slow yourself down and didn't let the survivors know that you were watching them via the eyeball icon. I think C tier is fair for something like this. Prototype rotor. Gain 5% haste when entering the detection zone triggered by a survivor. Doesn't stack, triggers once per active drone, and goes away when you hit a survivor. And as it turned out later, also when the survivor leaves the zone, but I guess you can expect behavior to match the description of their add-ons to what they actually do. Interesting concept, but unfortunately it was too hard to make it work, as it had too many activation requirements that were hard to meet. Compared to other chase add-ons, it just didn't look too viable. C tier. Iridescent unpublished manuscript. Activating a drone gives it a 32-meter terror radius for 15 seconds. Applies only to one drone at a time and increases the activation cooldown by 25%. This one could be used to confuse survivors on the other side of the map and give them things like colorophobia and unnerving presence, but I'm not sure if it was that effective. Gonna put it to C tier. And there you have it, that's all 20 add-ons. You might not agree with every tier placement, but I think we can all agree on one thing. This wasn't exactly the most thrilling set in the history of the game. By the end of the first day of the PTB, players started realizing that they had a full-blown disaster on their hands. The Skull Merchant basically ticked every box on the how not to design a killer bingo card. She was complicated, boring to play against, and weak. And yeah, I know, after all the cool stories I told you about her drones, the last part might sound weird. But nope. After survivors adapted to her playstyle, it turned out that she was actually kinda dogshit. Chase-wise, she had it rough. Once survivors figured out how her power worked, they knew the best strategy was just to not engage with her for as long as humanly possible. So they just shoved W'd and pre-dropped every pallet they could like it was a comp tourney. And since she was just a generic M1 schmuck, there wasn't much she could do except obediently follow them halfway across the map. Eventually she would log them in a tile where they would have to take a hit to avoid a drone. But then what? More shift and W gaming? If you wanted that, you could just play Myers. At least it's simple, and figuring out his power doesn't make you feel like you're studying for a f***ing exam. Her map control also raised some questions. Ooh, look at all these dots on the radar. I know exactly where every survivor is. What am I supposed to do with this information? They're across the map and behavior didn't give me anything to actually get there quickly and pressure them. So if you wanted to make this killer work, you really had one option. Go full on gen defense mode. That's where she excelled. And that's what eventually led to her demise. Almost everything about the PTB Skull Merchant, no matter how broken or stupid, made it to live servers. I've only found 5 differences. First, the eye icon was gone. And honestly, that was the right call, cause having it made tracking way too easy to counter. Second, failing a drone hack was now actually punishable, since it instantly made survivors exposed. This made getting interrupted by the Skull Merchant while hacking very undesirable. If she showed up, you had to run, but as you remember, pressing shift failed the hack, so most of the time you'd just be handing her an easy down. Third, the devs renamed Overcharge to Supercharge, clearly didn't want to overwork themselves, and nerfed its battery life bonus from 20% to 12. Guess they didn't want claw traps to be too annoying, but if that was the goal, they totally missed the mark. Because the real issue wasn't the timer itself, but the fact that walking into the detection zone reset it. Last but not least, the drones now didn't become unhackable when a survivor with a claw trap was near. I don't have the access to this version of the game, so I can't quite tell if this actually made it possible for trapped survivors to disable drones. But at the very least, now them being around the drone no longer cuck their teammates trying to disable it. On live servers, aggressive gen defense remained the most popular way to play the Skull Merchant. In fact, this playstyle became even more common. So much so that many Skull Merchant players stopped playing the game normally altogether. They didn't even bother going for survivors anymore. Instead, as soon as they loaded into the match, they went straight to the tightest 3 gen on the map, loaded it up with drones, and started patrolling it. This let survivors finish 4 gens for free, only to be forced into a brutal 3 gen standoff, which was insanely hard to win. Since survivors in the detection zone showed up on the Skull Merchant's radar, she always knew exactly which gens needed protecting. Disabling drones didn't help much. In fact, it often made things worse, because it gave survivors a claw trap. Now they were trackable even outside of the detection zone, and there was no way to get rid of it, because they still had to push gens, and with how quickly the Skull Merchant could reset disabled drones, they'd keep running into new detection zones, never giving the trap timer a chance to run out. Basically, messing with drones was a complete waste of time. Whether you disabled them or ignored them, you ended up in the same situation, sitting on a gen while being exposed with the Skull Merchant always knowing where you were. And if she had the no terror radius add-on, it was only a matter of time before she popped up from behind a corner and downed you. Now imagine all this in the context of a quad slowdown build, and you'll understand why the devs started actively changing her just 2 weeks after her release. In patch 6.6.2, they made the first attempt to shift her power away from camping gens and more toward chasing. To make that happen, they cut down on her drone spam by making them return to her only after their respective claw trap was destroyed. To prevent survivors from holding her power hostage by never removing the traps, they made them automatically self-destruct once the battery ran out. For the same reason, they also stopped batteries from refilling when survivors entered the detection zone. In short, all this made the Skull Merchant wait 45 seconds after deploying a drone before she could use it again. That was already crazy long, but you could make it even worse if you equipped Supercharge, which is why experienced players treated it like it was AIDS and didn't recommend running it even if it was the only add-on you had. Additionally, the Skull Merchant gained a haste effect that increased based on the number of survivors trackable by the radar, whether due to a claw trap or standing inside the detection zone. This effect had fixed values, 3% for 1 survivor, 5 for 2, 6 for 3, and 7 for 4. It applied passively, so you didn't need to inspect the radar to benefit from it. And since it lasted as long as survivors remained trackable, it essentially essentially functioned like bloodlust on steroids, allowing her to catch up to survivors in loops much faster. Even without randomized strobes, geographical readouts, or prototype rotor. Moreover, ultrasonic speaker was made basic in this patch. Combined with the haste from trackable survivors, this made looping her a nightmare if you had a claw trap. Because not only did it speed her up, but also you couldn't vault pallets without leaving yourself open for a cheap hit. Ultrasonic speaker itself was reworked, and now it reduced the activation delay of the undetectable status effect while inside the detection zone by 50%. Super mid, because just like with many other add-ons, this time was already short, so it barely changed anything. 3 more add-ons were slightly rebalanced. To make adaptive lighting more appealing, the devs increased the linger duration of undetectable from 2.4 seconds to 3 seconds. Yeah, I'm sure that made everyone want to use it. The rarity of prototype rotor and expired batteries was changed from ultra rare to very rare and vice versa. The latter no longer had the stipulation that starting traps couldn't recharge and were removed upon depleting its battery, because those two mechanics were now default for all traps. In other words, this add-on simply made all survivors start the match with a claw trap that lasted only 18 seconds. The timer was reduced again, so it wouldn't steal your power for too long. This made the add-on a little more viable, just a little, since the haste effect from all 4 survivors let you reach them faster and build momentum early in the match. An interesting fact that I found on the DBD wiki is that in this patch, Behavior updated the icon of the shotgun speakers, adjusting the shading of the individual shotgun barrels to avoid possible trypophobia triggers. That's fear of repetitive patterns or clusters of small holes. Translation: the original icon reminded people of honeycomb, and Behavior wanted to avoid that. A pretty unique situation. I didn't even realize it until I read about it. Did all this stop Skull merchants from committing 3-gen abuse every chance they had? Nah, not really. It made it a little less convenient, but definitely not impossible. Her insane tracking still allowed for pretty efficient area control, and the new haste effect helped her rotate between gens faster. By the way, kinda ironic. Extra haste was one of the 2 changes meant to encourage Skull merchants to chase more, but it still ended up being used for camping gens. What I find funny about this patch is that it reverted the change that prevented drones from going unhackable in the presence of a survivor with a claw trap. Now they would fly up again, just like on the PTB. Which raises the question, why? Why introduce a change just to revert it literally 3 weeks later? But honestly, it's not Behavior's weirdest decision regarding the Skull Merchant, and later you'll see that for yourself. By the summer of 2023, Skull Merchants took 3genning to a whole new level. Basically, they turned it into a sport. It was no longer about buying extra time for the main objective, which is downing and hooking survivors. No, now they were protecting gens just for the sake of it, just to see how long they could stall the game. And soon the maximum possible limit was found. It turned out that after exactly 1 hour of being an absolute 3gen terrorist, the server would automatically shut down the gaming session and disconnect all players in the lobby. Naturally, the discovery of such a blatant abuse caused a huge backlash in the community, at least among survivors. Killers, on the other hand, seemed pretty happy about it, with many rushing to take advantage of it, whether out of curiosity or just to be malicious. This made playing Survivor unbearable, cause every other match was yet another Skull Merchant dingos trying to hijack your PC for an hour, and the only way to avoid it was to disconnect right away, but doing it too often stacked up the matchmaking penalty to the point that soon you couldn't queue anymore. And that's how the Skull Merchant earned her first nickname, the Gen Merchant. Among all the Skull Merchant mains who bought onto this playstyle, one stood out the most. His name was CM9I. On July 18, 2023, he made a Twitter post claiming that relying on chasing while playing this character was cringe, and that if you wanted to dominate with her, you should play her the way she was meant to be played, namely by defending 3gen setups. He even compared it to playing chess, because of course it had to be chess. People just don't seem to know any other comparisons for smart things. I'm not sure if this was his genuine opinion or just rage bait, but it definitely got a lot of attention, especially the chess part, which quickly became a meme and earned the Skull Merchant her second nickname, the Chess Merchant. And if only it had stopped there. But 3 days later, CM9 was back on the community's radar with another post calling out Nightlight, one of the best comp players, for being bad. A heated exchange followed, eventually leading to CM9 challenging Nightlight and his team to a scream match. His plan was to use the classic Skull Merchant build and prove the world that even the best comp team wouldn't be able to keep up with him. And to his credit, he almost did. He managed to stretch the game out to something like 45-50 minutes. But I guess you can't underestimate the power of comms in DBD, because in the end, Nightlight's team humbled him with a clean 4-man escape. I'm not bringing up this nearly 2-year-old drama just to shit on CM9 or glaze Nightlight. The point is, even after her first rework, the Skull Merchant's gen camping was still ridiculously strong. So strong that it literally took comp-level coordination to overpower her. With that in mind, Behavior had no choice but to take another shot at reworking her. Several months months after the CM9 incident, they dropped patch 7.3.0, and judging by the humongous list of changes it brought to her, this time they meant business. To begin with, the devs further decreased the Skull Merchant's drone spam by introducing a 10-second cooldown for placing drones. This made her power feel very sluggish, because quite often when you placed a drone near a gen or in a tile, by the time you reached the next one, it was still on cooldown, so you had to awkwardly hang around it for a bit before you could use it again. Active mode, as well as the most mechanics stemming from it, was deprecated. Now drones used only laser beams to detect survivors. When you deployed a drone, the beams were first invisible and rotated slowly. This was called stealth mode. Sounds big, but in reality it was pretty useless, because drones still emitted light where its beams came out, so their positions were fairly easy to pinpoint. If a survivor crossed a beam, they became visible and their rotation speed increased. Basically the old scouting mode. Getting detected by a beam showed survivors on the radar for 10 seconds, gave them 1 stack of lock-on, and made them immune to other beam scans for 3 seconds. Lock-on stacks couldn't be removed unless the survivor was downed. They could stack up to 3 times. Once this happened, the survivor would become fully locked on and receive a claw trap. While lock-on no longer made survivors exposed, a similar effect was achieved with the new properties of claw traps. In addition to providing haste and radar tracking, they now injured survivors and made them broken for as long as they remained attached. If a survivor was already injured, claw traps also inflicted deep wound. Bolting pallets with the claw trap no longer caused them to break. Instead, when trapped survivors were detected by a drone beam, they suffered from 10% hit rate for 6 seconds and were revealed through Killer Instinct for 3 seconds. Beams could be dodged by crouching or standing still as they passed through, kinda like the Hax traps, and that feature alone pretty much buried 3-genning for the Skull Merchant. Since removing Active Zone also removed the Detection Zone, the devs had to rework how the Undetectable effect was applied. Now the Skull Merchant became undetectable for 8 seconds after placing a drone. It was much more useful, but I'm not gonna lie, as a survivor I absolutely hated going against it, because it happened way too often and led to way too many cheap and completely undeserved downs. The volume of her footsteps for the killer's POV was made much quieter, so the heels clicking didn't overpower potential sounds from survivors. Placing drones made their beams always spawn perpendicular to the Skull Merchant's view. This was meant to make drones more viable during chases, giving you a chance to get an immediate scan on a survivor in front of you. If that didn't work, the devs added the ability to change the beam's rotation direction using the radar. I guess that was kinda cool, but I don't know, if I played the Skull Merchant, God forbid, I'd probably be too lazy to micromanage drones like that just for 1 stack of lock-on. Just like before, drones could be hacked, but since the logic behind claw trap tagging was changed, hacking only disabled them for 45 seconds. Disabled drones no longer disappeared like they used to. They stayed in place and you had to manually recall them. But on the other hand, since the drone's disabled timer weren't tied to the trap timer anymore, you didn't have to wait even a second to get them back. You could do it the second they became disabled and then use them again. Alternatively, you could leave them where they were and they would eventually reboot and re-enter stealth mode on their own. Only that took 45 seconds, so yikes. Failing or interrupting the drone hack applied 1 stack of lock-on. Since all these changes took away a huge chunk of what made the Skull Merchant popular, the devs decided to sugar pill it a little with some buffs. For starters, the number of her drones was increased to 6. Their boot time was decreased to 0.3 seconds, and the minimum distance between them was decreased to 16 meters. On multi-floor maps, drones could now be placed directly above and below each other. Before, this feature was redundant, because the detection zone had the shape of a tall cylinder, which affected survivors through walls and floors. But now that the detection zone was gone, restricting vertical drone placement didn't make sense anymore, so the devs allowed it. The movement speed penalty while using the radar was removed, and you could track survivors and manage drones without any slowdown. This patch also included a major add-on pass for the Skull Merchant. Some add-ons were simply buffed, while others were completely reworked to fit her new mechanics. In total, 18 add-ons were adjusted. Here they are. Ultrasonic Speaker decreases the duration of the beam immunity by 25%. High Power Floodlight. Claw-trapped survivors suffer from blindness. High Current Upgrade increases the time survivors appear on the radar when detected by a beam by 1 second. Arrivalente number 1 reduces the success zone size of skill checks for claw-trapped survivors by 20%. Supercharge extends the battery life of claw traps by 15%. Stereo Remote Mic reduces the time drones stay disabled after getting hacked by 15%. Shotgun Speakers. Survivors with the claw trap have no skill check warning. Low Power Mode decreases the cooldown for deploying drones by 25%. 25%. Adaptive lighting increases the duration of the undetectable effect after deploying a drone by 20%. Vital targeting processor increases the hindered status effect by 3% when a survivor is detected by a drone. Loose screw. Receiving a claw trap makes survivors exhausted for 6 seconds. Brown noise generator. Claw trap survivors suffer from the oblivious status effect. Randomized strobes extends the duration of the hindered status effect for claw trapped survivors when detected by a drone by 1 second. Prototype rotor increases the drone rotation speed by 10%. Advanced movement prediction reveals survivors' auras for 6 seconds when they receive a claw trap. Iridescent unpublished manuscript. When a drone is disabled, it gains 32-meter terror radius for 15 seconds while the Skull Merchant becomes undetectable. Expired batteries increases the strength of the haste from tracked survivors by 25%, but at the cost of reducing the battery life of claw traps by 50%. As a result of all these changes, the Skull Merchant's add-on set actually became a bit more appealing. However, given the overall nerf to her mechanics, it felt like a very small consolation. The last thing Behavior did in this patch was change the Skull Merchant's chase music. When she first came out, people complained that it was repetitive and gave them a headache, probably because of that weird background noise that sounded like an old printer. Guess the composer didn't learn their lesson after the Ghostface chapter. In the 7.3.0 update, this noise was removed and the track was re-EQ'd with more bass. Even though this patch was an undeniable downgrade for the Skull Merchant, when it went live, I remember seeing posts on socials actually praising the changes. Obviously, that was just copium from Skull Merchant mains, who didn't yet realize that it was the beginning of the character's complete downfall. Over the next year, the devs kept introducing various minor tweaks and quality of life updates for her. Patch 7.3.1 added prompts on the HUD to let you know which direction a drone will start rotating if you press the rotate button. Patch 7.3.2 reworked low power mode to remove rotation from drones and make them stationary. Patch 7.5.0 made laser beams appear white when they couldn't detect you as a survivor. Patch 7.6.0 nerfed the mangled mechanic and made it timed, and as a result, Power Glass received a 70-second timer. Meanwhile, the complaints from survivors didn't stop, because even though the 3-gen Skull Merchant was now a thing of the past, she was still extremely boring to go against. The only way to fix this for good was to go back to the drawing board and come up with a brand new concept for this killer, one that wasn't based on territory control. But such things don't happen overnight, and in the meantime, to make the complainer shut up, they simply nerfed her to the ground until no one wanted to play her anymore. On the 8th of October 2024, we received patch 8.3.0, which became the final nail in the Skull Merchant's coffin. In this patch, drones lost stealth mode. Now, unless they were hacked, they were always in scouting mode, which made them a lot more predictable. The number of beams per drone was reduced to 1, so dodging them became a piece of cake. The increased haste from survivors having a claw trap was gone. It was replaced with a fixed 5% haste for 8 seconds when scanning a survivor within 5 seconds of deploying a drone or changing a drone's rotation. Because of this, the devs also had to partially reverse the previous rework of expired batteries. Now they made all survivors start the trial with claw traps, but this time the battery life of initial traps was reduced to 50%. The rest of the traps had normal batteries, but their duration increased by 10% for each claw trap received up to 150%. On top of it, the hindered penalty for survivors scanned while having a claw trap was decreased to 8%. Fast vaulting survivors were no longer detected by drones, and all this is a long way to say that the Skull Merchant's chase potential completely went down the drain. Her movement speed when deploying a drone or inspecting her radar was down to 4.4 meters per second, which kinda made sense, cause normally killer abilities come with a small trade-off. But later it will prove one more time that Behavior had no idea what they wanted this killer to be. Besides expired batteries, the devs also slightly nerfed the values of ultrasonic speaker and vital targeting processor. And that is just... why? Were they really that problematic? It's like at that point they were just changing things for the sake of changing things. In exchange for all this, drone beams became visible only within 16 meters for both killer and survivor. Think of it as a middle ground between the old stealth and scouting modes. The drone rotation speed was slightly increased from 85 degrees per second to 95 degrees. Thanks, I guess, but I don't have a habit of playing DBD with a protractor to spot the difference. Survivor's immunity period after being detected by drones was decreased to 2.5 seconds. Again, cool, but good f***ing luck detecting someone in the first place. And remember how I was talking about Behavior's weird balancing choices? Check this out. Just 2 weeks after this patch, Behavior revisited the Skull Merchant and removed the movement speed penalty for inspecting the radar. Can we stop, please? Why can't you just have a vision for this killer? You just decided you wanted this penalty. You probably even spent some time thinking whether or not it was a good idea. Yet here we are, reversing this change not even a month later. I swear, behavior is the definition of we always make the right choice, but only after we've tried all the other options. And that wasn't even the only thing they reversed. They also partially scratched the invisible beam feature. Now only survivors couldn't see drone beams outside of 16 meters. And again, it made perfect sense. Your own power shouldn't create challenges for you for no reason. But they should have thought of that even before the 8.3.0 PTB, so that they don't look stupid adding and removing things back to back. The only thing I can praise them for in this update is that they added the ability for the Skull Merchant to see the auras of the drone beams within 32 meters of them while inspecting the radar. This helped players use her beam rotation feature more efficiently while chasing survivors in close tiles. The last change for the Skull Merchant was implemented on the last PTB, where behavior finally decided to diversify the terror radius values across different killers. As part of this update, the Skull Merchant's terror radius was reduced to 24 meters. Not sure if it's gonna make it to live servers. By the time this video goes public, this patch will have probably already arrived, so you tell me. This is the state of the Skull Merchant so far. She started as a gen merchant, then became a chess merchant, but after having been completely butchered in 8.3.0, I guess she's just a merchant now. Cause she's so weak, her current pick rate is below 1%. But this is not the end of her story. Like I've said before, the massive nerf was just a temporary solution until they figured out the real one. And they've already started working toward this. Recently they made a post where they suggested a new concept for the Skull Merchant. It's basically a mix of her 7.3 version and twins. They want to reduce the number of drones to 5, give them 2 beams back, but slow down their rotation and make them practically invisible so that you only see their direction but not the actual distance they reach. Kinda what we used to have with the old stealth mode, except that now it's gonna be the only mode. Getting caught by one of the beams will reveal your position on the radar. After a drone has been active for some time, the Skull Merchant will be able to take control over it and freely fly it in any direction. This will make her undetectable, like the twins when you're controlling Victor. Controlling drones will consume their power meter. Idling will consume less of it, while moving will consume more. And most importantly, you will be able to charge drones at the cost of the remaining power and send them forward at a super high speed. The longer you charge them, the faster they fly. Hitting a survivor with a charged drone will injure them and destroy the drone. Same if you miss and hit an obstacle. On top of it, the Skull Merchant will have something like an ultimate ability. Once it's charged and activated, a global warning will play for all survivors. For a short period afterwards, any survivor who actively sprints will be revealed on the radar, and in order to prevent it, they will have to crouch or stand still. Like before, drones can be hacked. If you do it successfully, the Skull Merchant's aura will be briefly revealed to you. If you fail, your aura will be revealed to her, and you won't be able to interact with other drones for some time. This version isn't necessarily what's waiting for us in the future. It's more of a hypothetical concept the devs put out for feedback to see if it had potential and was even worth investing time and money in. Unfortunately for them, the Twins Merchant wasn't very well received, so they'll probably have to either change it significantly or scrap it in favor of a completely different concept. That said, I won't lie, I'm feeling a little pessimistic about the future of the Skull Merchant. This preview makes it clear that the devs aren't giving up on the idea of area control, which is exactly what makes this killer boring. But you know what? Whatever they do, I just hope that they make the next version of her simpler. Seriously, even after 2 years of constant changes, she still remains one of the most bloated killers in the game. Like, there's so much going on for her that behavior couldn't even include all of it in her power description, because otherwise it would stretch all the way down to hell. For example, nowhere in the description does it mention that crouching and standing still lets you ignore drone beams, or that hooking a survivor near a drone makes it disappear, or that if you stand below a drone it fires a claw trap at you and instantly makes you locked on. And a lot of other things which when people discover they get absolutely mind-boggled that all this time it has been a thing. The funny part is that some of those mechanics don't even make sense. Like for example, you might have thought that getting a claw trap when standing below a drone is an anti-chase mechanic, which prevents survivors from running beneath drones and loops. But no, it doesn't work when running, it's only when you're standing still. Why did you even program it? You actually took time to create a mechanic that is useless, isn't advertised anywhere, and only 3 no-lifers like myself know about. Would have been a lot more productive if you spent the same time fixing the drone placement mechanic, so that these motherfuckers sit exactly where I press M1 and not randomly fly 15 meters away from that spot. Anyway, the bottom line is that I hate this killer. I hated her before as a survivor, her, but now that I've spent several weeks digging in different versions of her power, I also hate her as the killer. You can't even imagine how hard it was to get this video done. Every time I thought I was done with one part of the video and wanted to move on to the next one, another obscure mechanic popped up out of nowhere and I had to go back and redo everything. I'm not even kidding, I was literally yelling at my screen sometimes. That's how much it was triggering me. So yes, the Skull Merchant and every line of her stupid spaghetti code. I'm tired. I just want it to end and never ever hear another word about this degenerate piece of shit again.